Hello, welcome, or welcome back to the Insect Podcast. Zoya Podcast producer here. This week, Matthew is joined by Bob Pick, Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Tokio Marine North America Services, a conversation that Matthew teased 2 episodes back when he spoke to Adrian Coupland at Ernix. This week, we cover all things AI. So what does AI adoption in one of the world's largest insurance companies really look like? You're in for a sneak peek this week. In this episode, Bob shares his unique perspective on how generative AI is reshaping the insurance industry, from improving processes like submission ingestion and claims fraud detection to enhancing advisory capabilities. Matthew and Bob also explore how Tokio Marine is embracing experimentation across its global markets. If you're curious to know what AI is out there and how other insurers are utilizing its capabilities, let's dive into the conversation to find out.
Bob, great to have you joining us. I've really enjoyed following some of your writing, and of course, everyone today is talking about AI, generative AI, but it seems to me you've got one of the best perspectives on this, a sort of good balance between what's real and what's hype. But thanks for joining us. I think you're based in Philadelphia today.
Yep, sure am, and happy to be here.
Fantastic. Just in terms of who you are, so EVP Chief Information Officer at Tokio Marine North American Services, and you also got a role of Group Deputy Chief Information Technology Officer for Tokio Marine Group globally, of course, based in Japan, one of the largest insurance organizations around the world. So it feels like that must keep you fairly busy.
It does, and it's also a mouthful to put all that in either a LinkedIn tagline or an email signature, but that's true. Yeah, we're in 47 countries around the world.
Well, look, wrapping up towards the end of 2024, what for you has been like the biggest takeaway or most notable moment of the last year?
I don't know if there's one moment, but a couple of themes and observations for sure. One is the evolution of omnipresent generative AI from just a collection of piece parts into products, into usable things that it doesn't take, a PhD or a team of engineers to actually get in place. We're not quite done with that process yet. It'll probably continue for many years. The speed at which that happened was remarkable. So that's one theme. The other, I would say, in 2023, that was the year of insurtechs all becoming AI companies, meaning they switched their domains from .com to .ai. But in 2024, they actually began to inculcate AI, both classic AI and generative AI, into a wide variety of products in some pretty meaningful and useful ways. So we saw in just, again, such a short 2 years' time, a very fast evolution of these non-incumbent technology and solution providers really getting it, working hard to kind of make the highest, best use of new AI and generative AI technologies in their products. And that relates to the third trend that I saw very much in 2024, which is that insurtech providers, and again, solution providers as well as pure play tech providers, are definitely on the path of learning more insurance. A number of years ago, even up till maybe 2-3 years ago, it was tech forward and insurance kind of would come along for the party at some point. But I think that transition really occurred in 23, but became very, very clear in 2024 that insurtech providers are really seeking out insurance knowledge at foundation, as opposed to coming up with a groovy, cool idea for a widget that they think will solve something, and then maybe asking for insurance perspective whenever they're past their seed round or their A or they've fumbled a couple of projects. And I think that's very good. It certainly is very good for those of us in the industry on the carrier and agent MTA side, but it also is good for the insurtechs in that they are able to have more relevant solutioning happening earlier in their process. And I saw that in droves this year, starting with first half of the year, various conferences and things that you see, and then the change to the conferences later on in the year, I felt was fairly marked. I was talking a lot more insurance business with a number of these insurtechs than I was just the pure tech. So those are some thoughts and some trends for 2024.
So, Bob, 3 great themes in there, just to recap on those. So the first one you mentioned was that we're moving from generative AI being a sort of collection of parts. People have got to build the application themselves to something that's much more integrated. And actually, I talked about before, actually happening behind the scenes. And then, secondly, which we definitely will talk about, companies have now started to drop the .com and add on the .ai. Everyone's now calling themselves AI, but what does that actually mean in practice? And then the third one, which is really encouraging, and I think is interesting, your point about even over the course of a year, seeing how what might have been technology first, but maybe to the sort of focusing on the insurance aspects of some of the technology companies now, a much more integrated view from insurtechs, actually not necessarily offering insurance, but at least understanding. So I definitely agree with those three themes. I did want to come back on that middle one because I feel there's a little bit of, and it slightly frustrates me, and I wonder if it frustrates you. People sort of mingle AI and generative AI, and I don't think they always understand the difference. But just for sort of the layperson's guide, can you just help anybody that is a little bit too casual about their use of AI versus generative AI? What are the differences between the two?
Absolutely. And I would note, maybe for following conversation, that even from a regulatory perspective, we're seeing very, very broad definitions of AI that could potentially even include a little algorithm that sits in a cell in an Excel spreadsheet. Any machine operation on data, some of these definitions are. But in my view, I tend to use the word classic AI and generative AI just to distinguish. Classic AI, basically specific algorithms operating on vast data sets. There's also the machine learning aspect of it, where you can kind of feed into a cycle where, as data is added and as that algorithm is run, you gain accuracy there. But the idea in a simple way is, you've got a set of data, you have an algorithm, you run that algorithm against that data, and you get an indication, typically numerical indication of probability. But the key thing is, you can run that algorithm against that data set now. You can take that data set and run that algorithm 5 years from now, 10 years from now. As long as the data set and the algorithm are the same, you're going to get the same probabilistic answer. Generative AI uses some of the same underlying technologies, but it is really designed to basically take vast quantities of data and do extremely detailed pattern detection. And from that, figure out basically what is next. So the idea in terms of generative AI, meaning it generates something. If it's generating text, it will basically figure out, based upon the prompt that's issued, which is not a mathematical algorithm. It's typically a plain language question that's asked, or hence the name prompt. It will figure out from the prompt that's issued, what's the most likely first word, and then second word, and then third word, fourth word, on down the line, based upon this incredibly detailed set of patterns that is detected. Similar type of approach when it's creating an image. What's the likely next best pixel to put on screen? Same with video. So with that, though, in the generative stage, where classic is dealing with a data set and a mathematical algorithm over top of it, typically, generative AI is dealing with natural language processed prompts that is then taking massive patterns based upon a vast array of data. And it's coming up trying to figure out what is the likely potential next best word to put in a sentence. There's a lot of fuzz in there. And that's where issues that exist, very particularly in the generative AI space, such as bias or hallucinations, where those patterns can actually result in a word or a series of words that aren't actually drawn from its data set, but to the pattern detection, to the backing algorithm, it seems to be the most likely next word to put in that sentence, even though it may be completely non-factual, counterfactual, rude, obnoxious, or illegal. So these are the things in generative AI we need to be concerned about. But the one that I often call out as a big differentiator between generative AI and classic AI. Classic AI, as I said, you have a data set and you have an algorithm. If the data set is the same, the algorithm is the same, you will get the same answer. Generative AI, because of all the pattern detection, processing, and probabilities that go into it, you can have a data set which is essentially the same or the same, and you can issue the same prompt, but you might get a slightly different answer. You might even get a materially different answer depending upon when issued. So as a regulated industry the world over, having that lack of certainty in terms of getting an answer from generative AI is a vastly different risk scenario than getting an answer from classic AI.
No, thank you. I mean, that is good to know that my mental model of the two was actually consistent with what you said. I mean, particularly that point about traditional or classic AI is still what we need if we're looking at large numerical data sets. And then that point about you can replicate it because there is a specific formula in there. Looking at ChatGPT today, I noticed they even are starting to offer me two versions. They're kind of doing A/B testing, which is marketing testing. Do you like this answer or do you like that answer? And both answers are actually quite different. So in fact, it doesn't, not just the case you run it again, but you're actually giving someone that right in front of them, which is probably quite healthy actually in the sense of recognizing that there are differences in there. But I want to come back, something you wrote about, and we again, I probably need your help in just explaining the terminology, but we're hearing a lot about Copilot these days, and it's a little bit confusing because Microsoft has got its Copilot product. But I really like the way you described it, which is that think of Gen AI as a Copilot. It can do a lot of heavy lifting, provide incredible, valuable insights and support without having the final say on business decisions. So again, it'd just be helpful just to sort of unpack that a little bit, the distinction between Copilot as a product, I don't even know if it's been trademarked, versus a kind of concept that is important to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Microsoft Copilot was the first, I guess, mass marketer at scale, quasi agent based approach. Agent being where it's taking a set of data that you provide and then through various processes, combining it with the foundation model and giving you highly relevant responses that are based upon the cohort of data that you provided to it. So Microsoft Copilot makes use of data that you can either upload to it or that is present in perhaps your SharePoint Online or email or whatever, and it operates against that, but using the power of OpenAI's foundational LLMs underneath it. So it gives you a more relevant experience, more business or personal relevant experience when factoring in your data, your documents, those sorts of things. But that really is a trend in agent based where many providers are coming out kind of a cottage industry at the moment with basically co-pilot functionality that allows you to have a hyper relevance interaction with a generative AI agent that gives you very detailed information or very specific information. So having an agent that is very specific to your customer service processes or manuals or your underwriting processes or manuals, that really seems to be a new trend there. Microsoft is the trademark Copilot is fairly general, but the growth of agents to help answer very specific questions, and even to the point where a particular knowledge worker, to use the generic term, might actually have several different agents for several different purposes. That seems to be a trend that has some legs. Now, the question is whether all that specificity, or at least perceived specificity, is really adding value remains to be seen. But what we've seen at Tokio Marine Group in our experiments with Microsoft Copilot, there absolutely has been an improvement in the amount of time spent on mundane research activities, summarization, note taking, those sorts of things, which Copilot does really well, being so closely associated and really built in with Microsoft Office 365. It has not been necessarily a watershed change, meaning we're not seeing whole tens of hours drop out, but it certainly creates a convenience factor. And I think it's sort of it and the agents are a great example of what I call the advisory aspect of generative AI. And we're seeing advisory aspects begin to progress into action aspects. So advisory, as you noted from the quote from one of my posts, is really intended to give a human being more information or better specifics or just a faster turnaround on some action that they need to take so that they can then evaluate it, take steps, and make that ultimate business decision. That's something that certainly is lower risk from a regulatory perspective, lower risk from an audit perspective. That human being retains accountability throughout the process. They're just using Copilot or an agent to gain faster access to more relevant information right at their fingertips. But seeing that shift into prompt AI, where generative AI process is put as part of a business decision-making process itself, and a human being is not prompting it and getting an answer and evaluating that response, but it's allowing the generative AI or a combination of classic AI and generative AI to take action on a business question and then give an answer and allow that process to continue. That's the newer territory that we're getting into, and agents will have a part of it where it's not a human being prompting, but it could be a process that's operating as a human agent would on a particular strain or business workflow. Now that raises a wide variety of audit and risk issues as to who's really accountable for the decisions that are coming directly out of that generative AI agent or process that's put in place in the workflow. So we're seeing that development from advisory only or advisory primarily use of generative AI over to putting it in the action into a business material workflow. And I think that's going to be a much longer tail of timeline to sort out all the auditability issues, all the accountability issues. But it is beginning to happen, though the vast, vast majority of use, certainly that I see in the insurance industry for generative AI, is in that advisory stack to begin with. Things like Copilot or the now traditional use of agents.
And you mentioned in there what you're doing at Tokio Marine, and I know you've got various different initiatives and you've got the benefit of being able to do that around the world. So there's a couple of questions in here. So what I want to be, this is great to get some examples if you're able to share them, but particularly that you're balancing the pilot or the work you with between that advisory and actually any areas you're actually moving into that sort of promptless. But it'd be great to know if there's some examples you can talk about of what you're doing around the world with your customers or just within the organization itself.
Sure, there are definitely a couple of things that we've talked about publicly. The first and kind of broadest use actually occurred in late 2022, early 2023, where our colleagues at Tokio Marine Fire in Japan actually built their own LLM and then made it available for research internally, meaning for internal Tokio Marine employees in Japan could use it as they would ChatGPT, ask questions, get answers, those sorts of things. And it really impressive to me that the team was able to do that so quickly. I think it was in production February of 2023, though they had pilot out late at the end of 2022. So they had been doing some early work even prior to ChatGPT making its broad public release in November 2022. A lot of other activities that we've seen have really centered around trying to solve problems that hit the line between large volumes of data and automation. And one of the things I find very interesting is how the work that many of us have done over many years on RPA or other forms, kind of broader more broadly cast intelligent automation, how well generative AI seems to attend to some of those needs. For example, something that was extremely popular in insurtech land this year was submission ingestion, which had long been a struggle point between OCR, RPA, and some kind of black magic that would happen that usually cost a lot of money and result in unsatisfactory solutions. And now generative AI waddles onto the scene and says, well, I can actually help with many of the things that you would traditionally use OCR for. And I can also help with many of the things that you might use RPA to do that give the kind of perception of automation in there and do it faster because the pattern detection or the quote unquote intelligence that's built into generative AI can detect a lot of patterns if you have a large enough data set that it might take teams of people to explicitly train OCR to do. So we see a number of pilots and projects that have come about in this space where we might take one particular set of submission documents. And in the US market, of course, we have 50 plus individual regulatory bodies and 50 sets of state laws, as well as a few territories, to have underwriters or claims adjusters that know intimately all of those laws, all the little nuances, a little bit challenging. But to actually use generative AI to incorporate the various legal or regulatory requirements for a particular state or territory, and then have it review a submitted document to say, does it meet those criteria or not, is actually a relatively straightforward thing to do in generative AI, and then give an answer to that underwriter that's red, yellow, green. Is this something that seems absolutely clear, no problem? Something that maybe there's some ambiguity, or whoa, this does not meet the criteria that we've absorbed into either a foundation model or that we've ragged in to be able to take advantage of. And that very quickly gives that underwriter an indication as whether they need to spend substantial time on that submission document or whether they can just do a quick reality check. But the trick is that is giving an indication to a human being as to where they should spend their time. It is not giving a final answer. And I know we and many of our colleagues and competitors around the world that were CIOs and heads of digital I've spoken with, we're all very careful to make sure that we have disclaimers and flags and blinking signs that say, we're giving you an indication, but we're not giving you the answer. The answer is still on you. So whether it's reviewing a contract, a submission document, there are a number of pilots that we have going on. We have a couple of things in production that are along those lines. And then finally, the last set I've mentioned is interesting things around claim fraud detection, which in the US, we're predominantly in commercial and specialty, though we do have substantial personal lines as well. But the world over, claims fraud is an issue. As the evildoers get more sophisticated, the tech necessary to sniff them out is more sophisticated. That's an example where we have predominantly partnered with others who have external solutions. In the first couple of cases, these are things that we built internally or internally working with an SI partner or a technology organization. But in case of claims fraud detection, while there is some work that has gone on that's been internally based, for the most part, we're working with partners who have already been thinking about these things in the classic AI paradigm for many, many years. And now they're adapting their techniques to take advantage of what generative AI can use. So that's been another area where we've had some pretty good, if early, success around the world.
Thanks, Bob. Just a couple of acronyms in there. I'll just take them up. I mean, people will be familiar with them, but not everybody is. OCR is optical character recognition, which is basically taking text in from images and converting it into text. And then RPA, robotic processing automation, you mentioned in there, which is kind of interesting because the RPA there was a big surge of interest in that up to about 6 years ago, and it kind of stopped, but it's now been re-energized or overtaken by the use of generative AI and large language models, isn't it? So the classic case of people knew what needed to get done, they just couldn't get the tools to get them where they needed to get to efficiently.
Yeah, I would say RPA is actually a good analog for what we see happening with generative AI, meaning the techniques and some of the tools for RPA have been around for many years prior to, and I agree with you, around 2016, 2017. But it's just got hugely popular as the big three solution platforms at the time, Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, and UiPath. They just surged on the scene, tons of investment in them and some others. And companies like ours took great advantage of that. And we had working groups and centers of excellence around there. But I would say, in fairness to our RPA friends, there's plenty of RPA still going on and still being built now. I know for our North American group companies, it's become a key part of how we are able to meet and improve on timeline expectations for a wide variety of business tasks. But what's particularly interesting now is that interplay between generative AI capabilities and automation generally, not just robotic process automation, but other forms of automation. And that could be integrations, it could be ETL in terms of extracting, transforming, and loading data around. It's a lot of things that generative AI can or may be able to help with, either speed up, make it faster to market, faster to production, or help deal with nebulous or ambiguous things like unstructured data, which takes the form of anything that might come in an email or in a printed document, those sorts of things. Basically, not in a spreadsheet or a data set. That's where generative AI tends to sing, because it can incorporate and interpret a vast array of data much more quickly than a team of human beings can. There are challenges with generative AI. You would think that AI should never forget, and the classic AI really doesn't. But generative AI, it's not that it forgets, but the patterns really can be obscured, and something that is a more prevalent pattern can force data that exists in the data set down to where it's not tapped into whenever that generated result is being created. So it can forget, but the data is still there. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to take what we learned through the RPA process, which again had a slower but similar curve of interest, investment, and then actual deployment into production use very successfully. We can learn from the techniques we use to incorporate quickly that new tech and apply that over to generative AI as we go forward.
And Bob, just like different sort of questions, but as you're educating, helping your colleagues, particularly at the top of your organization and others, what's your sense now about where people stand in terms of their understanding of the value that can come from generative AI, but also starting to get their own intuition? Because it's really hard to make a decision on these kind of things. If you don't need to understand the full details, but you need to kind of understand the concepts. And where is Tokio Marine in terms of the people that are making the decisions having an intuition around what can be done and what can't be done?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say for any large global company, there's going to be some variability, and that's just natural, depending upon the market demand for these types of solutions, the market availability, those sorts of things. But in general, I think our executive team and our team of decision makers the world over has sort of taken the bull by the horns with self-education as well as a company provided education. And that can be training, it can be discussion. We have a number of different forums that we hold. Our generative AI forum is one that's been going on for almost 2 years now. We also have digital roundtable. We have other mechanisms to not only get information out, but to discuss these things and make sure that we're sharing one team and what they're doing, say in Brazil, and what a team might be doing in UK. So I think we've been effective in that regard. But also, there's just so much of this in the popular literature and kind of consumer use. And my experience is insurance folks tend to be rather curious, particularly those that are in the digital and technology world. But also, underwriters are inherently curious people. So a lot of people are playing with these things in their personal lives. They're using Siri, they're using Bixby, they're using Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT on their own. And for the most part, we have around the group, we have allowed controlled, curated use of some of these publicly available tools like ChatGPT pretty much since the get-go. But the nature of the industry, we're also from the beginning thinking about risk. And our Tokio Marine companies have taken a dual pillar approach, one being Let's look at the tech and the business use cases and how we might come up with interesting solutions for our business needs. The other is risk. How do we look at risk? How do we understand this nascent emerging set of risks that comes from the uniquenesses of generative AI? And I think those two pillars have so far served us well. I don't believe there is any carrier on the planet that thinks they have this all sorted out and are off and running. The risk part in particular is undulating as regulators and legislators begin to have their voices heard. And I don't think any of us want to get too ahead of the curve to where we're having to pull back things that are suddenly subject to regulatory muster that we didn't expect. But for the most part, I think that experimental aspect, experimentation, is alive and well. Another thing that I say probably too frequently is that the insurance industry does not give itself enough credit for the amount of digital and technological experimentation and kind of progression that we have made and have had over the last 15 years, and our rather quick adoption of generative AI, even if only in highly curated production uses or just pilot and prototype uses, is a great example of that. We're still just about 2 years since ChatGPT sprang on the commercial market. And we have insurance entities all over the world that are using it today. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. It would have been all risk, and we'd see how everything else played out, and then we might come in, a decade late. But now we're with the curve. We're not ahead of the curve, but we're with the curve. And I think Tokio Marine reflects that. We want to be experimental. We want to take advantage safely where we can, but we also take very seriously our responsibilities, not only to our regulators and our market makers around the globe, but especially to our policyholders and our trade partners. We got to make sure their data is kept safe and data is used appropriately, and that we understand this tech enough to be able to make the right use of it and not the wrong use of it. And that's something I think we and all of our competitors and colleagues take seriously the world over.
Yeah, some very good points there. But as you're talking, one thing that's occurring to me, and coming back to a point you made earlier, it can feel like sometimes this is an evolutionary rather than revolutionary moment, albeit evolution is happening incredibly fast in the last 2 years. For all the reasons you've given, people can now try this at home. You've got a generation coming into the working world that have used to using technology, that want to use technology. But you mentioned when you were talking about the rollout from Copilot, and I think a little bit more broad use of generative AI, that you said there hasn't yet been a watershed moment. As you look forward to it, whether it's 2025 or it might be the year beyond that, but do you see there's going to be a real watershed moment? I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is, because I was there when it happened, is like the rollout of email. I was working in a world where we didn't have email, and then very quickly everyone had email, and that really was watershed. Is there anything you can look at, you can say in the next year to 2 years, it's going to be a really significant difference in how we're working as individuals or as a business?
It's an interesting question. It's one that is fraught with danger, because I'm not a futurist, but I am an incrementalist, generally speaking. That's my orientation, just to fully disclose. I do see the technology as revolutionary, but the application of the technology is more evolutionary. But evolution can occur quickly. Charles Darwin would tell us things can happen fast or things can take millennia. I think in this case, we're seeing a quick evolution in terms of adoption of that revolutionary back-end technology. I certainly see, whether it's in my personal life of friends and family, or in business life, the fact that we're all using this stuff frequently, I think, is an important evolution. Has it fundamentally changed a business process, a life process, in a way that is material to outcomes? I don't think so, at least not yet. I think we're doing a very good job of incorporating the revolutionary technology into evolving our business processes. And I'll even say more broadly, our approaches, how we tackle problems, because we now have this other thing. And I'll give a very quick example. Tokio Marine operates a number of management and leadership training programs on a global basis. On our Emerging Leaders program, we had several AI-based projects. Everyone has to do a project in addition to their training. And two of the teams evolved ideas that they thought generative AI would apply to. One of them continued and was very successful applying generative AI. The other realized that, we'd like to do generative AI, but in the end, classic AI is going to be a lot faster and it's more fit to purpose. So one of the benefits of this revolutionary tech that has brought forth these new options as to how we tackle problems is a reinvigoration of understanding of a bunch of pre-existing tools that we already have laying around, that we understand better, that we have, that are usually in our tool or our wheelhouse anyways, in our tool set, and that have risks that are much more known and manageable. So with that, when you think about it, if I'm thinking something is truly revolutionary, meaning revolutionary from a business application perspective in the near term, I would think it would be pulling everything in one direction. I don't actually see that. I see a lot flowing in that particular, aspect of the river delta, but I see it also churning up a lot of other questions that will have other solutions or only partially be using generative AI. But that I would say is my maybe 1 to 3 year view of this. Now, when we're 5 years out looking back, will all these incremental changes and process adaptations and the adoption of this revolutionary tech be tantamount to a revolution because so much has changed? That's very possible. But in terms of how I see it being applied now and today and near term tomorrow, I see it more evolutionary adaptation to and adoption of this revolutionary back-end tech, but I don't see necessarily it throwing out whole swaths of existing value stream or whole swaths of existing business workflow. I think it will enhance, simplify, and shorten the timeline for a wide variety of things, but largely within the way we're working today.
No, I mean, I really like that observation you made. I mean, I've discovered that myself. I think actually more recently as well, when you start to think, well, all these things could be possible now that we've got access to generative AI or other derivative tools. So once your kind of mind opens up to the world of possibility, you then kind of explore the solution. And then to your point, the solution doesn't actually always have to be the new tool. Sometimes the solution was just sitting there. And an example might be some of the power of Gmail to organize email. You don't have to necessarily go down a Copilot route, but actually once you start looking for it, you find it. It is a mindset shift in there that I think is really intriguing. And then, Bob, just before we wrap up, just you've touched on this a little bit in terms of some of the things you've used personally. Is there a tool that you could recommend to people that you think is a sort of great example and a great time saver, or something you've really enjoyed using that's a accessible tool to people? And ChatGPT is the one most people are familiar with, but if there's anything else you've got you'd love to share, that'd be great to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the boring answer is Microsoft Copilot, but I really have found it to be extraordinarily useful. And in particular, being a global company, translation is a substantial issue for us. So, a quick example: we held a generative AI forum. I'm forgetting which one it was earlier this year, and I hosted with friends like Patrick Gallick, who I think you've interviewed previously. And we have 40, 50 people on there from all around the world doing generative AI. And we're talking, but not everyone is an English speaker. Sometimes the pace gets a little too fast, but to be able to turn around right after that meeting and produce transcripts in 5 different languages, get everything out, done, that's something that used to take me, I'll just say, way too much time. And now it's just a button push, and for lack of a better way of putting it, it's so simple. Those types of things I think are hugely useful. I'll note also that whether it's Grok or Midjourney or your image generator of choice, being able to create images, and I'll just leave it in a business context. It's also fun to create memes and all sorts of silliness, but in a business context, being able to create an image from a prompt and relay a business point or a vision in a way that would have either had me going to our corporate communications folks and bothering them for a week or whatever is super helpful. Now, I strongly believe we have to be careful about generative AI produced images not being in the same category as art. But I will say, from a business perspective, some of that tooling has been remarkable in being able to take someone who does not have an artistic bent and allow me to get something out and relay that to the business community. Microsoft Copilot and other similar tools allow you to do that for PowerPoint purposes and to take data and put it in. But I will say one of the most fun things that I've been able to do this year is to be able to talk to my Excel spreadsheets and ask for insights and things like that. I can't say it has been watershed useful for me in my decisioning, but it's been very, very interesting to see what comes out. In some cases that I didn't think of, in other cases, it was just kind of crazy or not relevant. And that's partly drives my sense that adoption is evolutionary, even if underlying technology is revolutionary. Because getting used to that, sorting all that out, I am not throwing out 30 years of my personal work style, work process because I have a new widget. I am interested in seeing if I can improve or incorporate that new widget into my 30 years of work style. But yeah, I certainly have enjoyed playing around with some of that. And finally, you have the human training that goes into all generative AI. There are some engines that apply more for certain reasons, other less for other reasons. But having a little fun with something like Grok that isn't quite as polished, I think is very interesting because it takes you to different places in the data and in the prompting that you're doing. And it is something to see the differences between these major pillar generative AI platforms that have grown up, to see what their differences are, how they treat, whether it is by topic or their style of output, literally the writing style of generative that they produce. Very, very interesting stuff.
I've just got this image of talking to spreadsheets. I mean, I bet you've, not your spreadsheets, I'm sure, Bob, but the spreadsheets that are floating around the world, if you went to a spreadsheet and say, where are you hurting? Where are your formulas broken? What's causing you pain? You'd get all sorts of really interesting insights. We've got self-cleaning ovens. Now we're going to get self-healing spreadsheets. That's definitely a question I'd recommend anybody asks. Grok and Midjourney, I think, is the other one for image generation.
Yeah, Grok is part of X or Twitter. So it does images, video, and text. Mid-Journey is another standalone. It operates through Discord, actually, and is an image generator. There are many others. I mean, Gemini can generate images. We have a shout out to our good partners at Google. There's a lot of them out there. These are just kind of top of mind. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, and maybe this does work potentially toward revolutionary, not evolutionary, is the use of all this stuff on the back end for development. We have seen, and we've done a number of prototypes and pilots across the group to create requirements from old code to translate between languages. We're doing one right now looking at moving stored procedures to Java, which for any insurance company, you probably got a few thousand stored procedures laying around. So being able to use generative AI on the back end for those tech purposes, kind of deep in the weeds where it doesn't necessarily have to be polished, it just has to be good. It certainly is a cottage industry. It may turn to a revolution, but I'm not of a mind that I think developers go away. I think developers are just doing higher order finishing tasks rather than doing the grunt work of kind of writing that first line.
I'll take that one. A little bit to my point before about trying to get an intuition about how things work. I did a couple of Python courses and sort of modeled my way through. But what was really intriguing was the ability of ChatGPT to create code, check code. I mean, you really get a sense how completely different that is than the way most people experience, which is written text in a very small scale. But to me, that it probably is revolutionary. Yes, coders aren't going to go away for sure, but certainly the time saving can be massive. Is there any one final thought just to leave with people, either about you or Tokio Marine before we wrap up?
No, I think I appreciate that. There's been a very interesting conversation. I would say I think Tokio Marine is interested in being experimental, and we are. We have an advantage because we do operate in so many markets, and we allow kind of autonomy amongst those markets or across those markets so that experiments can be done, whether it be generative AI, other tech, digital, or products, go-to-market approaches, can be done in a way that is relevant to that individual geographic market or that particular product market. And generative AI and the growth of it kind of plays into that, meaning we can do a lot of simultaneous experimentation across many business use cases and then share that back with the team. That's sort of we call it the power of the group. But the reality is, as an industry, I certainly see, and I'm sure you do too, the massive interest that continues in this. And I would say, if not massive investment, substantial investment that's going along. But I think we're in the right headspace in thinking about the groovy tech and the risk and making sure that we're balancing that appropriately. I say probably too often that we're never going to be an industry that just slams in some new tech and calls it a day. We're regulated. We can't do that. And we curate and care for our policyholder information too acutely to even, think of that. So that balance of risk and new, the excitement about the new, but making sure that we really know how this thing operates, how we can keep it safe, and how we can use it appropriately, avoiding bias, hallucinations, drift, all the kind of downsides of it. And I do feel as an industry, we've got our heads roughly in the right place. No one's going out crazy far doing anything wacky. Flip side is there probably are some who are just waiting and seeing. I think that's a little bit of a challenge too. Getting conversant with it, trying it out, understanding how it may or may not influence or operate in your environment is critical, especially now when everyone is in an exploration mode. Another year or two, it's going to be application mode. It's going to be build it, get it out, roll it. So if you're not prepared and you haven't developed that internal vocabulary to use for this stuff, I think that'll be a challenge. Those are kind of some of my thoughts about where we are as an industry.
Well, Bob, that's been fascinating. I learned a lot there. And again, thank you very much for your time. And thanks for the support of Tokio Marine as well for what we're doing at Instech.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, if you've made it this far, then I'm pretty sure you found that as interesting as I did. If you haven't already heard, Exponential Risk London is a new 2-day conference hosted by Instech, dedicated to addressing the evolving needs of the global catastrophe and climate modelling community. Tickets are now on sale, and hopefully we'll see you in March. That's all from us this week. Goodbye.